Well, welcome back, everybody. And for those who are here, please remember, all telephones off. And thanks again to our sponsors, AOC Archaeology. And we've enjoyed the first of Professor Singleton's wonderful lectures. And so now, I think if we're ready, I would like to welcome her very much to talk about the Gullah Geechee and archaeology at Butler Island.
So I guess some of you are wondering, well, who are the Gullah Geechee? And they're African-American communities on the southeastern coast of the United States. And if you're familiar at all with the map of the United States, which you probably aren't, or may not be, from as far north as Wilmington, North Carolina, and then all the way south to, I have Jacksonville, but actually this map shows that it's further south than that, like around St. Augustine. And so this is a fairly large area. This is where rice was cultivated along the coast in the 18th and 19th centuries. And and they live like within 30 miles or 48 kilometers inland. And so it's an area of approximately 12,000 square miles. So they're descendants of the enslaved people that worked on these, on rice, indigo, and cotton plantations along the coast. But Gullah also refers not just to a people, but a people with their own language. And Gullah is what the language is usually called. Geechee, at least some researchers, some scholars think Geechee is actually a dialect of Gullah that people primarily in Georgia speak. And so the two, anyway, so it's only, I'm not exactly sure when people start referring to them as the Gullah Geechee. I mean, that's been somewhat recent. I mean, and when I say recent, I mean like in the past 20 years or so. Because as a child growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, I only heard of the Gullah. I didn't hear about the Geechee, except from my father, who called us Geechees because we ate a lot of rice, which is the staple of most Charlestonians. And he wasn't from Charleston, so we call us Geechees. But it's only been after I went to graduate school, I learned about the Geechees. And here in this slide, I'm just giving you some ideas of what an English word would be, or what some of the English words are, and what are the Gullah Geechee equivalent, like goober and peanut and bakra, referring to a white person, jaga for insect, and nan and nana for elderly person and grandparent. And of these words, I know that nana is a word in West Africa, in a lot of West African languages, that's used for to refer to an elderly person or a grandparent. They're also known for their foodways. These actually are all dishes that I'm very familiar with. And I mean, I'm not a Gullah Geechee because I don't know, I don't speak Gullah, I don't know Geechee, I don't know the language. But, you know, having grown up along that coast, I'm familiar with these foods. You see okra. Okra is one of the ingredients that people in in the coastal southeast eat a lot of, and this isn't necessarily the case in some other parts of the South where at least the African Americans I've met, they hate okra because it's slimy, or that's how people think. A lot of people don't like okra because it's somewhat slimy. Cowpeas and rice, that's another specialty in the area, as well as seafood, gumbo, or just seafood and fish. Seafood is very important in Gullah Geechee foodways. And then this last thing, red rice. When I've been to West Africa, the equivalent there of red rice is jollof rice, which is almost made almost identically the same way with tomatoes and rice, and sometimes you put other kinds of vegetables in it. As I was saying, fishing and seafood is an important food source for Gullah Geechee foodways, but also it was an important job. It's an important occupation that some people, some Gullah Geechees are still involved in the fishing and seafood industry. The little town of Darien, which is just 5 minutes or 5 miles, I would say, just north of Butler Island that I'll be talking about, they still every April have a blessing of the fleet of the shrimp boats going out to collect shrimp. So fishing and seafood procurement is still very important in these areas. And this slide showing a lead weight, which almost all the excavations that I know of slave quarters at Gullah Geechee sites you frequently would encounter these lead weights, and they would use in the casting nets, like the one in the photograph showing the man with a casting net. That's actually one of the crafts too that it's hard to find them now, but that that became very collectible among the Gullah Geechee. And then the sweet grass baskets, that's the craft they're primarily known for. There's still very much a vibrant production of these, primarily in South Carolina. Fewer basket makers seem to be in at least Georgia. What's interesting about in the historic photograph, which is from Sapelo Island, an island I'll talk about in a few minutes, you'll see these, these big baskets, and the two young men are wearing, and here are the tops to those baskets. It's my understanding from not most of the people who've done studies on these baskets, but from at least two people I know who've gone and looked at primary sources, is that there's some suggestion that actually man made a lot of these baskets before emancipation, and then, or during the time of slavery, and that women really began making them more after emancipation because they were sort of introduced to making this, to making the baskets. So in other words, they started making them because people who were trying to find ways of having them to make money once they were emancipated, recommended that they learn how to make baskets. But a lot of the the local sort of folklore sort of suggests that this was always a female craft, but anyway, that's, I guess, is maybe something that hopefully will get unraveled at some point as more people do research on the history of the baskets, particularly during the time of slavery. Another thing that's characteristic of the Gullah Geechee are their religious and spirituality, their religiosity and spirituality. And they're known for various religious practices. Their spirituals in particular, some of which have been recorded. And one of the things I had hoped to do was to just have a short audio tape, but of the Sea Island singers, just to give you a sense of the spirituals. But anyway, I'm not that technologically savvy to do it. I don't know, maybe I'll work on it between now and Sunday, and just so you can maybe hear the music. And a praise house was simply a small, usually it was a small church where people went to worship. And as far as I know, there was an archaeologist who was, he said he'd either excavated one or had identified one that he was going to excavate. I'm not really sure what happened with that project, but because he was hoping that maybe he could find artifacts that were related to some of their religious practices. And then a ring shout is a type of practice. I think a lot of their religious rituals and practices are going to be intangible performances, so I'm not sure what one would find if they excavated a praise house. But a ring shout was a ritual in which the worshipers moved around in a circle, clapping and playing with makeshift instruments like the washboard you see in the lower image. The upper image is a ring shout from the 1930s, and then the lower one is a reenactment that I actually went to in 2014, I believe, when I was on the Georgia coast, and actually at a homecoming at the Butler Island plantation. This was one of the performances that this group did. They aren't necessarily descendants from Butler Island, but I believe they're called the Darien Stompers, and then there's also the Macintosh Stompers. So they do these reenactments of a ring shout at various cultural festivals. But it's possible that some of their religious beliefs are not just African and Christian, but also Michael Gomez, an African-American historian at NYU, New York University, he wrote an essay in which he says that a large number of the enslaved people among the Gullah Geechee, or that became among the Gullah Geechee, were actually Muslim, and perhaps the best known Muslim was Ben Ali of Sapelo Island. What he's known for having in his possession this diary, and it's not sure whether he actually, it's called a diary, people refer to it as a diary or notebook, but no one really knows whether he actually wrote the Arabic in this, or it was just a book that he acquired for someone else, or someone else did the writing. But those that have looked at it says that it describes various rituals and religious practices. Ben Ali was originally enslaved in the Bahamas, and his wife, Phoebe, and their children, along with some other enslaved people, were purchased by Thomas Spalding of Sapelo Island in 1802. And then once he gets to Sapelo, he performs the work of a driver, that is a slave overseer, on Spalding's Sea Island cotton plantation. And he became an important figure among the Gullah Geechee on Sapelo. And he's the fictive patriarch for many of the Gullah Geechee in the area. One of his direct descendants is Cornelia Bailey, and she wrote a book about her life growing up on Sapelo, and she denotes in the title of her book is Saltwater Geechee, and she distinguishes between the saltwater Geechees lived on the barrier islands, the islands that border on the Atlantic Ocean, and then the ones that live further inland were known as the freshwater Geechees, like those enslaved at Butler Island. And she referred to sort of the folk religious practices, not Christianity, because she made a clear distinction about Christianity and the folk religion. She uses the term Dr. Buzzard. One of the things she says is that you prayed to God, the Christian God, for good, and you prayed to Dr. Buzzard when you wanted to do something that wasn't so good, to maybe a neighbor or something. So they're known, the Gullah Geechee, for these various things: foodways, religiosity, their language, and their crafts. So it's a distinct African American community and people. So to talk more about my career and my encounters with the Gullah Geechee, it begins on Sapelo Island. In fact, my career as in plantation study of archaeological study of plantations began on Sapelo. My first year, or the summer of the first year of graduate school at University of Florida. And that's, again, just showing you where Sapelo Island is. It borders on the Atlantic. And all these little islands and estuaries, that's what encompasses this area that we think of as the sort of, well, I wouldn't call it a territory, the Gullah Geechee territory, but certainly where many of these communities lived historically, and some still live there today. There I am, my back. For some reason, every time someone photographs me in the field, I'm never facing. I'm never facing them, or I almost all my pictures in the fields just shows me from the back. But anyway, here I am, taking measurements on a sugar mill. So my introduction to plantation archaeology wasn't really investigating a slave quarter, but actually looking at an industrial site. And And the site, once it was excavated, and the person who wrote it up, he was in my cohort in graduate school, Ray Crook, he did this rendering of what this horse-drawn or animal-drawn sugar mill probably looked like. Sugar was a short-lived cultigen on, well, the Carolina or Georgia coast. I mean, it gets much too cold in the fall for sugar to survive, but they did experiment with sugar. The primary crop, though, of Sapelo Island and of a lot of the barrier islands was Sea Island cotton, which is distinguished from the short stable cotton that most of the cotton that was produced in the southern United States was the short variety for coarse, that was used to make coarse cotton cloth. The Sea Island was a much more silky cotton with a specialized market. And it's primarily, and as you can see on the stamp, it mentions St. Christopher, Nevis, and Anguilla, all islands that were formerly, or I guess, well, they're probably still part of the Commonwealth, but were part of the British West Indies. They all produce cotton, as did the Bahamas, because they weren't really suitable for sugar. And so that's where the sugar, cotton was, it's called Sea Island cotton, it's known as Sea Island cotton even in the Caribbean, but it was introduced in Georgia by way of the Bahamas, supposedly through loyalists who fled to the Bahamas during the American Revolution. My next summer in the second year of graduate school, I worked on a contract project on Colonel's Island, Georgia, which has been totally redeveloped into a shipping terminal. I don't have any slides, or I guess I have slides from Colonel's Island, but I didn't have them available. So I just did a Google search to see what I could find out about Colonel's Island, and it just looked like a terminal for delivering for delivering automobiles. So it's no longer functioning as a part of this coastal landscape, as it once did. So Butler Island then was a former rice plantation, and as I was pointing out that it's in the inland. Cornelia Bailey refers to people living on places like Butler Island as freshwater Geechees, but actually, naturally, before it was reclaimed as a for rice cultivation, it's actually indicated it has a it has some brackish water. I don't know how exactly they were able to prevent the brackish water from ruining the rice, but somehow they were able to do that. And this is what Butler Island looks like. Well, it didn't look like that when we were excavating, but when it is being irrigated, that's pretty much what it looked like. And then this image is of a steam-powered mill for milling the rice, taking off the rice has two shafts, and this mill would have taken the first shaft off the rice grains, which certainly was a lot easier than having to do it by hand, or at least took less time, I would say. So just an image to show you what rice looks like in the field, or wet rice, that is. Rice is also grown in more dry situations as well. So this map shows Butler Island. Like I said, it's a marsh island. And on here it says, or at least at the time when I had this map drawn, it refers to it as brackish marsh. And this whole island, as well as these other surrounding islands, had to be reclaimed to cultivate rice. And at Butler Island, it took at least probably 10 or 15 years. And I include this historical marker, which indicates that the Dutch engineers came. The owner of Butler Island, he had Dutch engineers to come and do this reclamation of Butler Island. And when I was doing my research, I actually came across evidence that supports that that's what happened in Georgia. I make that point because in South Carolina, on the other hand, there's still a debate as to who introduced rice and the roles blacks and whites had in that situation. I mean, or who, what role blacks had, Africans had in introducing rice, and what role did the white planters have. And so there's this debate. The black rice thesis, as it's called, suggests that Africans played a major role in introducing rice, or if not actually introducing rice, but in figuring out how to cultivate it, and because they were rice growers, or many of them were rice growers in West Africa. And then those who oppose this theory, they just don't see any basis for it. They said, when they look at where a lot of the enslaved people from to South Carolina, where they were from. So anyway, it's a hotly debated topic. Whether you go with the black rice thesis or you're opposed to it. There isn't a white thesis for rice, but anyway, there are people who oppose the black rice theory. But I say all that to say that at least in the case of Butler Island, we know that at least the people who reclaimed the island were Dutch, because there is documentation to point that out. So my project at Butler Island at the time, and still is, was a waterfowl management area beginning in the 1950s. The owners at the time, actually he was a tobacco magnate, J.R. Reynolds. He sold Butler and General Island, which is this island. He sold it to the state of Georgia for $1. And ever since that time, it's been a wildlife management area. But also, because of that, it's also a historic preserve as well, preserving Butler Island. So at that time, what the managers at Butler Island wanted me to do was to indicate where the archaeological sites were, because they would, in their activities, they would plant seed for the waterfowl, and every fall they would have a big duck hunt. And so it was in part, I was able to do this project because they had a desire to know where the archaeological sites were. And then the idea too was to maybe identify these so that there would be like a trail for people who wanted to come to Butler Island, not to hunt ducks, but to find out about its history. And so this map showing the sites is based on both field work, but also on a lot of the, some of the historic maps that were available. The cemetery, which is controversial, or at least, well, I should say it's controversial to me because some of the archaeologists in the state of Georgia more recently, the recent ones, told some descendants that they didn't know where I got this information from, that there was a cemetery there. But in the 50s, a well-known archaeologist, he's known for work in Mesoamerica. He worked briefly for the state of Georgia, and he, he wrote a report and showed on the map where they found these burials, they're all in coffins, and there are a lot of children coffins. There were small coffins. And so it was reading that report and where he indicated on the map where it was that I came up with that, but I haven't been able to relocate it because unlike the cemeteries I showed you, there's no above ground evidence of it. But other than that, all these other, and I also didn't find the sugar works that was on an earlier map, and that probably is because it was either a short-lived venture or maybe it was something that was in the plans, but it never materialized. So the settlements there were like 4 settlements where the enslaved people live. So the settlement 1 is where you also had an overseer house, and there are slave quarters there. And then settlement 2, one was very much disturbed. We only did some preliminary testing. A highway, an interstate, a major freeway goes over or was constructed that totally destroyed settlement 2. Settlement 3, well, let's just say the one day I went over there, we did see some chimney falls, but we also saw 3 water moccasins and an alligator, so we sort of avoided settlement 3. And so settlement 4 was the one that I actually did some excavations. And it was probably the most preserved. 3 might have been preserved, but like I said, just doing field walking, as you say here in the UK, after seeing those water moccasins, I said, no, I'm not going to stay in this area. But we didn't see anything like that we didn't see water moccasins, but we did see 5 chimney falls where the foundations of chimneys, and you could see them above ground. So I thought that was a good area to go. And then in the documentary record, we had a indication of when that settlement was occupied, because that was the last settlement that was established, and the date for that was like 1806. So I thought that was a good place to focus. I guess you're wondering, well, why were there so many settlements? Well, at its peak in 1850, there were over 500 enslaved people on Butler Island. Butler Island was like the second largest in terms of slave holdings in the state of Georgia at that time. And the total slave holdings of the particular family, the Butlers, at its peak had a total of 919 enslaved people. They were the second largest slaveholders in Georgia, although they didn't live in Georgia, they lived in Philadelphia. So this is just showing some of the excavations. Again, a photograph of me not looking at the camera. But these are just some of the artifacts. There was nothing like colonialware or no handcrafted artifacts recovered at the site. We did find a number of woodworking tools. That's just an adze, but there are other kinds of woodworking tools, and all of them came from this one slave cabin that I think might have been occupied by a cooper. Butler Island had excellent documentary records, and it would list the enslaved people by the settlement and what their occupation or skill was. And so each settlement had coopers because they made the big barrels for the rice. They also seem to have had, I think each one had like a blacksmith, but they're like little, contained communities, each of those settlements. And then we actually, because of the wet environment, we actually found some organic materials like these shoe soles. We also found like peach pits and some other things you wouldn't normally find in this, the soil. In most of the coastal area tends to be highly acidic, but the wet conditions seem to have preserved at least a few organic materials. And then these are gun flints, but also what I don't have a photograph of, or we also found like other gun parts to indicate that they were probably engaged in hunting. Well, hunting as well as killing the rice birds, because that was a real problem with rice, and the only way to really eliminate them would be to kill them. So that's probably why they had access to firearms. And then, as I mentioned, it wasn't just the slave areas that I was investigating, but also like the tidal. There was a tidal mill there were two tidal mills. One we didn't find any evidence, archaeological evidence of, but one we did. And then here is irrigation gates. The waterfowl management people still use the gates to flood, to irrigate the area when they plant the food for waterfowl. And then it's just an indication of some of the documents. There was a slave hospital, but that would have been at Settlement 1, which had a lot of redevelopment and disturbance, so we weren't able to find that. And in fact, it was after I'd written my dissertation that I found these hospital books in Louisiana in the archives there. So I always have felt like I never really completed all the work that I could have done at Butler Island. But anyway, it was a site that just had a lot of documentation compared to many other plantations, and to the well, I guess in terms of my career, the plantation I did in Cuba was just the opposite. I mean, there were records, but there were just so many gaps in the records. And then, so this is probably what the slave quarters look like, what we call duplexes, a central chimney and a unit of some sort of social unit. I don't want to necessarily say family unit, but a social unit on one side, and another one on the other side. On the other side, there would be a dividing wall between the two really one-room houses. And that's what we found in Settlement 4. This is the chimney. This is the one side that we excavated, and then another another hearth would be on the other side. And the construction, it seemed like it was somewhat. It wasn't. Even though on this photograph it looks like it could have been a well-built structure, but these chimneys sort of suggested that they weren't, or that either there was a lack of bricks or something. It was sort of unusual compared to other hearths that I've seen. So I've talked about some of the archaeology. I just want to talk about the owners. Pierce Butler, it was actually his grandfather that founded Butler Island and these plantations. And it wasn't just Butler Island, but they also had property over on St. Simon's, on Barrier Island. This was their cotton plantation. And then they also owned this island, Little St. Simon's, which really functioned as a detention camp. Enslaved people that they considered problematic were sent to Little St. Simon's. It wasn't really a plantation, but it was called 5 Pounds. They probably did some cultivation at 5 Pounds, but it wasn't a plantation in the same way that Butler Island or Butler Point, Hampton Plantation was the name of their long stable cotton. And then they also had this other property called Woodville. Pierce Meese Butler, he married Fanny Kimball, who was a Shakespearean actress. They lived in Philadelphia, and she ended up writing a diary of her 4-month trip to Georgia to see his plantations, and she claimed she didn't know he was a slave owner when they got, when they were courting and when they got married. It was after she married him that she found out he was a slave owner. And while some people have been skeptical about that, other people have said, well, the Butlers probably didn't, because they're in Philadelphia, and this was after slavery was abolished in Pennsylvania, it's very likely that they didn't let people know, or maybe only a few people knew there were slave owners. So it is highly possible that she didn't know. And they didn't go to Georgia very often. They were in some ways like a lot of the British slaveholders in the Caribbean who were absentee owners and would only go occasionally. Well, that was what they did. And the only reason he went was because his overseer resigned, his long-term overseer resigned, and so he went down to hire someone else, and also to see just what the properties, how the management of the properties, how it was going. But she writes a journal while she was there, but it gets published in 1863, and it's a critique of a scathing, or some people would say it's a scathing critique of slavery. And there was all this mythology in Georgia for a long time about how this diary led the British against the Confederacy. It's just all these things about her diary. From my research, I found that some of her descriptions about slavery and their material life really seem to be supported in the archaeology. The infant mortality, that was supported in either records. The sicknesses of, particularly of women, that was supported in the hospital books. So a lot of what she said in her diary seemed to support at least what the kinds of things that I was interested in about the enslaved people. And Butler Island is probably the only project I've worked on where my findings were actually part of an exhibition. And so there was an effort, even though it doesn't look anything, the fabrication of the exhibit doesn't look very much like what we actually found, but I had no control over that. But there was an exhibit, it was a temporary exhibit in Atlanta, I guess about 2 years after I finished my dissertation. And then Butler Island after slavery. This one map has sort of haunted me all these years because I just haven't been able to find out much information about it is the problem. It just says rented out to Wiley, who was a planter in the area, in the Georgia coast, and just looking at the map, it seems like it was divided into small plots. And I did find out from people that I did interview that their parents, at least, remembered planting rice on Butler Island, after slavery. But they were saying that no one lived on the island at that time, and they commuted by small boats from some of the mainland areas. But I'm hoping at some point I find out more about this map and how long did that development take place. How long was it being farmed by small farmers, and were they at that point only still producing rice, or were they planting other kinds of crops? And then the person that really inspired, because, you know, when I started working at Butler Island, I could only think, gosh, this is a terrible place to work, no trees, you know, it's just hot and miserable. And I wasn't too excited about what we were finding. But the saving grace was Rudolph Capers, who was at the time, tour guide at a plantation museum in the area. And, you know, I went over and interviewed him because several people said, oh, he knows all about the history of the Georgia coast and, you know, slavery and plantations. And he was such a delightful person, and he remembers as a boy working on some, you know, rebuilding some of the dikes. I guess, is that what you call it? I can't even think of the word, but anyway, and you know, and he told me about a lot about Foodways, about how a real delicacy was soft-shell turtle, and that they would pick them up, they would catch them because they would come up the sun on the dikes around Butler Island. So he just was such a joy. And so for me, it made the study worthwhile to just be able to you know, do a project that had people who were, like, he was really immensely interested in what we were doing. So he died in 1983, but anyway, he was just, and actually for a lot of the projects I have worked on, there was always a very interested person who, you know, sort of kept me going and saying, well, this is worth it. And then finally, and I'll talk more about this in my lecture tomorrow afternoon, on sort of the African American heritage on the Georgia coast, and specifically, you know, again, the Gullah Geechee and the sorts of things that they're doing now to reclaim their past and preserve their way of life. So those are my acknowledgments for various people that helped me along the way. And well, and thank you very much.